One slip of steel can ruin a soul on paper. A knight's blade flashes in a cold church aisle. A cleric drops. Incense turns metallic, and in canon law the real wound isn't the blood. It's the invisible sentence that follows you everywhere. Automatic, sticky, reserved. The kind your local priest can't touch. Now the taboo question. What if medieval forgiveness wasn't mainly a feeling, but a jurisdiction, an office, a procedure, a price, and a private paper trail that could make scandals disappear without the village ever knowing? Here's the promise. We're going inside the Pope's secret forgiveness office, the Apostolic Penitentiary, the highest machine for conscience cases in the late medieval church. Then we'll map how a sin traveled from a muddy parish to Rome as a written supplica, and I'm teasing 2 payoffs you won't forget. First, the shock list: violence, apostasy, sacrilege, sex scandals, sorcery accusations, forged letters, sins so heavy they became a papal monopoly. Second, the hidden engine: fees, agents, networks, and the logistics of mercy, where salvation could be processed like a file and the church could monetize exceptions. But before the nightmare, ask, how was this supposed to work when it worked? And why did it feel secret even when it was official? In the medieval norm, conscience had lanes. The internal forum, confession, shame, spiritual repair, was meant to be handled locally, quietly, with penance and pastoral care. Yet some acts weren't only sinful, they were jurisdictional, because the penalty was so severe or tangled that only the Holy See could untie it. And that's where the penitentiary's 2 faces emerge: the officium minus, absolution for the gravest reserved cases, and the officium meius, graces by petition, dispensations and permissions that let people escape a canon law dead end. Vivid example 1. A couple discovers they're related inside forbidden degrees, yet their marriage is already binding lives, property, alliances, heirs, so the question becomes brutal. Do you annul the future or ask Rome to bend the rule, because a dispensation can decide who inherits, who rules, which families merge? Vivid example 2. A cleric carries an irregularity, a defect that can block ordination or ministry, maybe linked to violence, illegitimacy, or a disqualifying act. And suddenly the man who looks holy on Sunday is canonically disqualified on Monday unless Rome grants the exception. And here's the contrast question that turns your stomach. If your salvation, your marriage, your career, your legitimacy can be halted by a technical spiritual sentence, what happens when the only key is hundreds of miles away, behind Latin paperwork and Roman gatekeepers? Now watch it fail. Picture a petitioner in winter, hands cracked, riding toward Rome with a secret that could destroy him, because the local priest can listen, but cannot lift what's reserved. And the more serious the case, the more it demands silence. The iconic horror scene isn't flames, it's bureaucracy under fear. Your story becomes a file. Your sin becomes a category. Your fate depends on whether an official believes your wording, whether your agent knows the right formula, whether you can pay the composition fee, whether the letter arrives before gossip eats your life. Then, years later, the pattern interrupts. This quiet machine of mercy becomes one of the things critics point at when they say the church has turned grace into transaction, feeding late medieval resentment and, eventually, the wider crisis of trust that explodes across Europe. Because when people suspect forgiveness is being administered through money and privilege, what does that do to belief itself? So what kept the system running day after day if it risked scandal, cynicism, and backlash? Here's the hidden engine: profit and logistics. Because an office that handles petitions from across Europe needs staff, registers, formulas, couriers, and, crucially, revenue. And by the 15th century, the penitentiary is a major department of papal government and a substantial source of income through fees for certain graces. The workflow is cold and efficient. A problem erupts: illicit marriage, censured violence, sacrilege, a compromised cleric, a political mess. Then a supplica is drafted, often through agents and networks who know how Rome wants the story told. Officials evaluate what's being requested: absolution, dispensation, license. And if it's granted, Rome issues the grace, creating a private-leaning paper trail that's still unmistakably bureaucratic. Example: the power move of a hush-hush license to appoint a personal confessor. Imagine what that means for elites. Controlling who hears your secrets, who can absolve you, who becomes the locked box for your conscience. And here's your mini-loop question. When you hear reserved sin, ask yourself, reserved for holiness or reserved for leverage? Because the rarer the key, the more valuable the gate. Now shift settings, same theme, new rules. Move north, far from Rome, into places like the province of Uppsala, where ordinary people and clergy still reach for the Roman mercy machine between 1448 and 1527. And suddenly the penitentiary looks less like a conspiracy and more like a long-distance emergency service for conscience, except it still runs on paperwork. Example 1. Regional networks learn the routes, who can write, who can sponsor, who can carry, turning salvation into a logistical skill because the right petition can reopen a blocked marriage or rehabilitate a compromised cleric. Example 2. In Italian dioceses like Como, supplets show how local crises, scandals, forbidden unions, career-ending impediments are converted into standardized narratives that can be processed in Rome. And the delayed cleanup twist is deliciously modern. The penitentiary archives preserve the messiness that sermons smooth over. Petitions involving sexual transgressions, violence, sorcery accusations, sacrilege, forged documents. So centuries later, historians reconstruct the real medieval moral economy not from legends, but from administrative confessions that were never meant to be public. Which raises the next curiosity line. If the archive is this revealing, what is the biggest myth we've been sold about forgiveness in the Middle Ages? Here's the myth-bust reversal. Most people imagine medieval confession as purely local, priest, sinner, prayer, done. But the penitentiary proves that for countless cases the decisive act was not only spiritual, it was institutional. Some consciences required a papal switch to flip the sentence off, and that turns the story from private religion into governance by exception. Another reversal. This isn't just about vice, it's about legitimacy. English royal marriages in the 15th century show how penitentiary decisions could touch dynastic politics, because when marriage is the hinge of inheritance and alliance. A dispensation isn't a footnote, it's statecraft in sacramental clothing. So what's the final answer? Holy mercy, social control, or administrative necessity? Final answer. The Apostolic Penitentiary was a tribunal of mercy that genuinely aimed to untangle consciences in the internal forum. But it also functioned as a centralizing power that monopolized reserved cases and sold access to exceptions through a petition economy. And those truths don't cancel each other, they fuse. 3 motives locked into one machine. First, cosmic spiritual motive. Certain sins and censures were treated as so grave that only the Pope's delegated authority could heal the rupture. Second, social order motive. Dispensations stabilized marriages, inheritances, clerical careers, and reputations in a world where law and salvation were braided together. Third, institutional financial motive. Fees, agents, registers, and Roman administration turned mercy into a system that could scale across Europe. And if you want part 2, subscribe, because once you see how a secret office managed sin with paperwork, you'll recognize the same logic everywhere medieval power touched the soul. Comment question. If your future, marriage, career, salvation depended on a distant office reading your private petition, would you call that divine mercy or a medieval control panel for human lives?